Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm so excited to welcome you to CARE's Activist in Residence series. I want to begin by acknowledging the people of Rangitane, whose land forms the infrastructure for these conversations within academic spaces that we can have, but which also offers us an invitation to continually think about what the work of decolonization looks like. I am delighted to have with us today the activist Anjum Rahman. Anjum is going to spend this week with us in terms of working through strategies of developing anti-racist frameworks, particularly looking at the context of digital media platforms and hate. Anjum's activism spans 3 decades, with her leadership in founding a number of different organizations, the latest one being Inclusive Aotearoa Collective in the context of the Christchurch attack and response to that. But if we go back and really map out the kaupapa that Anjum has participated in, it is so inspiring. Beginning with her work with the founding Islamic Women's Council, her work with Shama in terms of creating the space, looking at violence prevention and responding to violence in diverse contexts, and bringing the question of ethnicity within that broader fold, and also with her leadership with the Labour Party in the relationship to council elections as well as parliamentary elections. So Anjum, it is so wonderful to sort of really looking at your trajectory, sort of come to understand the various roles you played all the way from activism, civil society to politics. So really looking forward to having these conversations with you, and welcome.
Thank you, Mohan. It's lovely to be here. Yeah.
Great. So, Anjum, perhaps we can begin by talking a little bit about your most recent work. And for our audience, I want to invite you to watch 3 interviews that we have already carried out with Anjum in various settings that will give you a sense of the history and also sort of the work of narrative building in terms of understanding where we are going to go with this conversation today. So, my first question to you, Anjum, is that, we are a few years past Christchurch. Looking at the landscape today in Aotearoa, what is your sense of where we are at today?
Yeah, so when I came to Aotearoa as a 5-year-old child back in 1972, and moved to Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, which is about 1.5 hours south of Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, and was very much a town centred around the farming community and the dairy farming that happens in the region. So I would say it was really difficult in those years. We were the first Muslim family to settle there, so there was really no point of reference for me locally, and our social group was the local Indian families. But at school, I felt very much isolated, and there was such a lack of understanding. And even accessing food, we used to have to drive to Auckland to access turmeric and other basic Indian spices. They weren't available. All you could get in the shop was this thing called curry powder, which was horrendous. So it was this mix of ignorance about who we were. I would say certainly there was a lot of racism then, but also a lot of curiosity and friendliness. It's that mixture that you have in Aotearoa. And moving on, when I think about the 1990s, there was a huge rise in racism with the political rhetoric, and we saw the rise of the New Zealand First Party, who had that as their selling point, and their base was anti-Asian rhetoric that had real offline impacts of violence, verbal abuse, intimidation, threats. And had personal accounts from people who were experiencing these things that was directly as a result of that kind of rhetoric. Also, then you had talkback radio, which was another inflammatory space. So before that, there was letters to the editor. Everyone read the letters to the editor. So there were always public spaces for racism to be displayed and to influence society, whereas other communities had much less access to those spaces. And then when we went into the 2000s, we had Don Brash and the Orewa speech. We had Winston Peters with his end of tolerance speech, and a really racist attack on Maori coming through from Don Brash, which is interesting since he's gone on to be part of Hobson's Pledge and other groups that are virulently anti-Maori. And we had, the anti-immigrant, anti-Asian attacks and anti-Muslim, the Islamophobia, particularly after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in America, and the ensuing war in Afghanistan, the illegal occupation and invasion of Iraq. All of these things, along with, the Bali bombing in London, created a really hostile environment for the Muslim community, as well as what was already going on for Maori and Asians. So I think, we could go back further into this country's history of colonisation, the poll tax, and all of these things, which feed into where we are today. So when I think of where we are today, I wish that we had come a lot further than we are. And I think to some extent we have, but we're losing a lot of ground. And I think a lot of that is because of online spaces, it's because of the disinformation landscape, the use of social media platforms and other platforms, the way that extremist groups are able to organise online, the way that states are using online spaces for basically what is online warfare, with targeted and well-resourced strategies to disrupt democratic processes in other countries, but to also disrupt social cohesion. So I think that then has an impact. And then we're also, looking at individual actors with wide support bases that are built off promoting hate. And so, you have Alex Jones in the US, you have Andrew Tate, you have Jordan Peterson, and so on, who, again, as with Trump, as with Peters, and so on, and that brash Orewa speech, create the conditions where it is acceptable to be outwardly racist and discriminatory, to be openly hostile, to be using the most awful language and be unapologetic for it. And they're building their political careers, and these influencers are making millions of dollars out of this. And I would say half the time they don't believe what they're saying. Alex Jones in a court case has just said it's just a persona he puts on, these aren't his real views, So it's not like these are good faith actors. They're doing this for particular reasons, for personal and political gain.
So, this is really powerful in terms of both the economic and the political infrastructure of hate, if you will. One of the things, Anjum, that you so clearly elucidate is that there is a history of racism and hate in Aotearoa. And at the same time, you're saying that digital platforms have sort of accelerated the rate at which this hate proliferates, if you will. How are you seeing that play out within the context of the elections 2023?
So I've tended to keep away from politics this year. It's just a personal decision I made. that I want to step out of it. And so I would say I'm not really up to date. One of the things that I did want to talk about is that what we're seeing online is not by accident, it's by design. And it's the very design of the platforms that are promoting um, hateful content much more and much faster than um, content that isn't hateful. And so, you know, and I've given this example in many speeches of the whistleblower on Facebook last year who talked about how they gave the outrage emoji 7 times the weight of a like. So when you hit the angry button on a post, it increases the chances of that post being seen by more people. I've seen examples of saying where, you know, the way that hashtags are weighted, that, you know, an extremist group with 25 posts was getting much more reach than another group that was, you know, promoting the opposite with many more posts than that. So it's by design, and then the recommender algorithms, and particularly in the past, YouTube was known for sending you into this rabbit hole of even worse and worse um, content. The algorithms where you like posts will then start tailoring content to you. You're teaching your Google searches, your social media to give you ever more extreme content. So this is not accidental. It's the way the systems are designed because that's how they get more traffic. That's how they sell more advertising. That is the business model. And it's only recently that there's any regulation or any kind of control, only in the last few years. So, and in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we still have none. We're still in the consultation phase. We're not even in the phase of draft legislation. And we've got an election in between. And we can see the response from some actors to some pretty horrendous events in the last couple of days. And I'd like to acknowledge David Farrier's writing around this as well. So an event in Tauranga when a group came in dressed as KKK and were awarded a prize, and nobody walked out. Nobody staged a protest. It sounds like nobody stood up and said, hey, this is wrong and inappropriate. Neither the organisers nor any of the participants. And another event in Otautahi, Christchurch, where a group came in dressed in blackface and were given an award for best prize, best costume. Right? And again, nobody protested at the event. Nobody walked out. And we're getting political actors who are defending this behaviour and saying we just need to take a joke without caring about the impact, the deep historical racism embedded in these things. It's really disheartening. It's disheartening, and I would have hoped that a huge part of New Zealand would have stood up and taken a stand to say this is not what this country is or what it represents, and to have it in the city where an atrocity has already taken place that was based on, you know, religious hatred. It's just inexplicable.
You know, this point that you bring up about the use of humor or the use of the trope of a joke, that seems to be a core element in the production of hate. I mean, you see this in the meme sphere, for instance, you know, with far right hate spaces, you know, using memes of Peep the Frog as an example, and often doing that through humor to both recruit participants and then to invite participants to engage in acts of violence, if you will. Do you have any thoughts on how humor is deployed, and also how humor then serves as a political strategy or gets political protection in that sense to further perpetuate hate?
I would say that humour is used to desensitize, right? So if we can laugh at a thing, it can't be all that bad. If it's funny, it can't be all that bad. But the question is, funny for whom? You know, and you hear a lot of people talking about punching up versus punching down. So if your humour is towards an oppressed group, an already vulnerable and marginalised group within society, and ridiculing them or making their existence the bane of your humour, then that is very separate to a marginalised group, you know, producing humour that punches up. Like, humour that holds powerful to account is incredible. It has huge impact, and we've seen political cartoons, political satire, that opens spaces, that opens the debate, that makes people see something that they otherwise wouldn't have seen. But humour that treads down and further oppresses is a political tool of oppression. That's what it is, and what it does is the opposite. It silences. It makes that group feel more excluded, more powerless. It makes them withdraw further. So to treat all humour as equal, devoid of context, is incredibly ignorant, I would say. And beyond that, it's not just ignorant. I think a lot of these people are doing it deliberately and by design. It's malicious.
Mm-hmm. So let's connect this to the hate speech laws and policies around hate speech that we talked about. It doesn't seem like New Zealand is the only space where this is being pushed. As sort of in global policy spaces, there is this recognition that digital platforms are important tools in seeding hate, in threatening social cohesion. There is a global movement in terms of creating regulatory frameworks to address the hate. Of course, the counter to that is a free speech argument. You know, you have seen the Free Speech Union mobilize vocally around this notion that platforms, for instance, being regulated around hate speech, the policies or frameworks silences free speech. How do you respond to that?
So my first response is that I'm always cognizant and mindful that whatever legal process is in place within a racist system is most likely to be used against the people that it needs to protect. So, for example, you know, I often ask people, what do you think got the biggest number of complaints to the Human Rights Commission? And they always, you know, assume that it's some kind of racism perpetrated by white people, or, but actually the biggest has been Honi Harawira's comments that he made in a private email that was made public around white MFs, and so on. And one of the other biggest complaints has come against Marama Davidson and her comments not too long ago around white men. And so you can see that even our institutions that were set up to protect human rights of legally protected groups tend to be used by people that aren't part of those groups a lot more. And I'm sure I've talked in the past to you about judging laws by the Trump test. That if you look at this law and someone like Trump gets in power and is able to implement it, what will be the outcome for marginalised communities? So, having said that, what is important is that we do have regulation, but we have adequate protections around it, we have adequate independence. So statutorily protected independence from political interference and from state interference. I still think the bar should be high, right? So when it comes to illegal speech, objectionable material, when you're talking about sending someone to jail for possessing or sharing speech of any kind in whatever format it is, then it does have to be an incredibly high bar to be illegal. And after that, you do still need regulation. So as a Muslim, I sit here unprotected by the Human Rights Act in terms of speech. I cannot make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. I can talk to them and they can try and put forward a mediation or whatever, like they would still try to help. But legally they're not required to. There's no legal process. If I went to the police, and they've told me this directly, that the threat has to be so direct to say, I am going to do such and such, before they'll act. And NetSafe has its own set of issues, and any number of people have talked to me about the way that that process does not work. And there's the issue of incitement against groups. So while they are more likely to act when it's a direct threat to an individual, less likely to act when it's a direct threat to a whole group. Now, it's not just Muslims that are unprotected. It's gender. It's sexuality. It's disability. You know, there's a whole range of people who are not protected at the moment. And it's really difficult because the people that target activists absolutely want us to be silenced, and they will go through any means to do that, to make you feel unsafe. They attack women journalists, women politicians at a much stronger rate than men. And forget about trans people, who are the current, group that is being targeted. So, yeah, it's really, we are very unprotected at the moment, and it feels very unsafe. And that doesn't mean that I don't think people should be stopped from criticising my faith. Absolutely not. If you disagree with that women should be wearing a hijab, say so. That's your right. I don't care. It's not going to stop me from believing what I believe. And if you want to say that, go ahead. Or if there's any other aspect of belief, and I should be able to criticise anybody else's faith, however I want to, without denigrating them. Right? I can say that this thing that you believe harms in this way. That is perfectly acceptable. So we do need to protect that space of disagreement and differing opinions, and being able to vehemently disagree with each other. Absolutely. For me, the most important thing is context. It's the context in which those words land. And so when they land in a context of where it's a majority population that is actively oppressing a minority, it has a different impact than when a minority that is being absolutely oppressed makes a statement against a majority population. Right? Those contexts matter. And so that's the thing that people don't understand about racism and discrimination. It isn't just hurt feelings, right? It isn't just that you said something and I'm just so offended. And I've said to Muslim people, like, calm down. That's okay, you're offended, but people are allowed to say that. That's not hate speech, right?
Yep.
right?
Precisely.
It's more than that.
Yes.
It is when it feeds into a systemic oppression, um, and a widespread pattern of abuse of a community.
Yeah.
That's when you really need to think about the impact of of that speech. And I always like context. I love to give this example so that people understand why context matters as well. So this is an individual example, not a systemic one. But you know me, you know my mum, you might know that she had a flu recently and she's recovered now, but you met me and you say, oh, how's your mum? I hope your mum's doing okay, right? And that would be a lovely statement. Now, if you were a mafia boss and I had some unpaid debt towards you, and you said, oh, Anjum, how's your mum? I hope your mum's doing okay. What is that? That's a deadly threat, isn't it? That's a statement intended to cause absolute fear and compliance and control. Yeah. Now, you tell me how an algorithm and machine learning systems, which are used for content moderation, will determine between the two. Right? And this is the challenge, because in the online space, the volume of content is so much that it is not possible to have a human being review every statement. Secondly, it is not possible for one human being to understand every single culture and cultural context in which statements are being made. And so you begin to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with, especially when you have coordinated, astroturfing, coordinated attacks against communities or against individuals. And also those coordinated attacks include using reporting mechanisms to try and get accounts taken down, right?
Yep.
You would have experienced this, absolutely. So, so that indicates the complexity of what we're trying to deal with in terms of regulation, and how can we deal with it. And for those who have been in family violence situations, we're very familiar with the way that abusers can make threats that look on the face of it as nothing. But you have to have been in that situation to understand the context and the way those words are used. And so very often in the past, the judiciary has not, neither have the police, been able to understand those contexts. And now we're in the space of trying to get online platforms to understand those things. So interesting, in a meeting that I was in recently, where someone said, oh, well, what is being proposed here is really provocative. And I was like, provocative? Have you been on the receiving end of a death and rape threat? Have you been at the receiving end of being targeted by hundreds of accounts, which might only be 10 people, but with bots or sock puppets or whatever, trying to silence you the way that, someone like Rana Ayub or so on have been targeted? That's provocative.
Yeah.
Having your name on a website with your home, a picture of your home and your home address and your workplace and your photo, saying that you deserve to die, you should be tried and you should be killed. That's provocative.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that website is up. Neither the police, nor NetSafe, nor the Classifications Office, nor the Department of Internal Affairs, nor Internet New Zealand, nor website host, nor the internet service provider. Nobody is taking any action to take that website down at the moment. Nobody. So these people have this list of names. I'm not even going to say the name of the website, of people that they are saying deserve to be hung for crimes against humanity. Mostly in relation to COVID response, but yeah.
I have experienced something quite similar, Anjum, in terms of having these fake websites come up that impersonate me. They've taken my picture, uses my name. So you would think when you get into the website that it's actually me, but it's a website that has clearly been created and being supported. And exactly what you're saying, that when raising complaints through a number of channels, be it to WordPress in this instance, or to Google, the search engine function, or to NetSafe, or to police, these infrastructures are limited and the website continues to operate. Now, there are real threats. I've received death threats, I have received rape threats on my emails, and some of those rape threats have been in Bengali, which is, my mother tongue. And then when I call the police to raise the complaint, they first want me to go through translating the rape threats, which is in vile, violent language. So, when I relate to what you're saying, this importance of context, it seems like that's a really complex and complicated question, because on one hand, the platforms seem to have the capacity to mobilize context in particular ways to magnify the hate. On the other hand, it seems that our infrastructures, from a policy standpoint, are always going to play catch up, simply because of the amount of resources that are going to be needed to respond to that volume of hate.
Yeah.
How do you sort of start grasping a policy framework that can anticipate the pace at which technology is moving and respond in any meaningful way?
So we're seeing some of that being done globally, some of it being done well, some of it being done badly. So we have examples with the European Digital Safety Act. Ireland has online safety legislation. Canada has. Even Australia in 2021, I think, set up a system. In the UK, they have Ofcom. So these frameworks are out there. And of course, we have our own consultation with the Department of Internal Affairs around safer online services and media platforms. So it is possible. And it is possible to hold platforms accountable for the design of their platform that exacerbates this kind of material. Because remember, there's the legal standard of objectionable material where stuff becomes illegal. But below that, we have, for example, the Broadcasting Act and broadcasting standards, which talk about accuracy, fairness, balance, non-discrimination, all of those things. We have Media Council standards, we have the Advertising Authority standards. So there are all these standards that we were expecting industries to comply with. We have no standards for social media, right? And so it is possible to put in place a framework where there are standards. Now, there is this joke of a thing where the platforms have come up with this voluntary code for dealing with online harm, which is, I don't think, in any way going to be effective or change the landscape at all, which is why we do need regulation. And I think, so again, you go back to the pieces of, if we're going to do it, how do we do it right? And I feel like the Broadcasting Act and the Broadcasting Standards Authority works pretty well. And out of all of them, like the advertising standards and so on, for me, they're a bit of a joke. I don't think that system works well at all. And you'll note that the broadcasting standards are supported by legislation. The advertising standards are not. Right? And that shows you that industry bodies alone are not actually really good or very effective in this. So you have a regulatory framework, but they are required to be public with their decisions and they to provide their reasoning. You have the opportunity to appeal those decisions. So all of those things are critical. That transparency, the right of appeal, and the right of appeal needs to be timely, right? I mean, because if your very valid post gets taken down for 3 weeks, the impact, the news cycle has moved or whatever, or the your ability to, if you are making money from your Substack or your whatever, people are not reading that anymore because it's yesterday's news, you've lost income, so on. So the ability to have the thing assessed quickly and a decision come out quickly, and especially in the case where, as we've talked about, where you're on the receiving end of a coordinated attack to try and get your account taken down, that needs to be dealt with really fast. If we got to the stage of websites being taken down, that's huge. So having a whole website taken down for one piece of really egregious content is a big move. So that would have to be pretty bad content. But even so, you should still have the right to appeal and to get that website back up really quickly within the day or within hours if it was unfairly taken down. So those are the protections. And then the other protection that you need to have is that diversity, both in the design of the system and in the policing and the monitoring of the system and through any regulatory framework. And what we've seen with online spaces is they have been dominated by certain demographics, and they've certainly been very male-dominated. And so, and we've seen that, play out because people think that code is somehow neutral. Code is not neutral. Like the design of online systems and code is very much enmeshed in the same racism and discrimination that exists in society. And so, we've had examples of hand dispensers that dispense soap that don't recognise black skin, so won't dispense the soap. Of photographs, there was proven on Twitter that when you do a post, it gives you a snapshot of the photo, not the full photo, until you click on the post to open it fully. And time again, if there were black and white people, it would put the white person's face up in the snapshot piece. It was designed, and probably not consciously, maybe or maybe not, but it was designed to do that. I hope that they've fixed that problem now. This is something I saw a couple of years ago.
And there's a substantive body of literature on algorithmic prejudice and the ways in which those play
yes, through the correction system and algorithms used to various other machine learning and algorithm tools. So getting diversity into the design and into all of those spaces is critical. Also critical, I think, let me be really radical here, is challenging the capitalist framework that is rewarding and financially rewarding hate. And that means a whole culture change, and it means a change to our values, our ways of thinking, our design of society. But when you look at media or social media that is run through open source, Creative Commons, charitable trusts like The Guardian, so on, you see the real difference. And interesting, when I was in New York last year, we met with Wikimedia, and they talked about being banned in Turkey and how they just stood up to, because they weren't a commercial organisation, so the loss of profits, while it was still a thing, it wasn't their primary consideration, and they were prepared to stand up to government there on whatever issue it was that escapes me now. But on the other hand, we are not seeing major media platforms stand up to the government of India, to other governments, when they're asked to geo-block and censor activists and academics and so on. They won't do it. So until we really hit at the capitalist framework that these organisations operate under, I don't think we'll come close to solving the problem, quite frankly.
This is beautiful, Anjum.
Now I'm feeling like I'm going to get done by being, the whole red's under the beds and that kind of
thing. I was just going to say,
commie. Well, for some things, capitalism works beautifully. When it works and there's competition and whatever, you would think in an ideal world, people would all migrate away from the platforms that platformed hate and go to platforms that didn't. But that's not how it's working. Our capitalist system is not creating that competitive environment that would provide the social benefit and the social good that we need as a society. And people are dying. Globally, people are dying. When you think about the Rohingya massacre, when you think about what's happening in Tigray, the example of the Kenyan case, the court case that's going on at the moment about a man that was shot down in front of his house, and the people that shot him just standing around, leaving him to bleed to death, and taunting him as he was dying. And this was preceded by Facebook posts that had doxed him, that had put out his home address, that had claimed that he was part of some extremist group, and the language and so on. And this Facebook post had been reported multiple times by his son and not taken down and proliferated. And the taunts that they used while he was lying there dying was the exact wording that was in these Facebook posts. Facebook has not even appeared in court in Kenya where this case is happening. They don't even deem it worthy to turn up to defend. Their argument is that there is no jurisdiction. But that's an individual case. Like, these whole societies, only 9% of the posts are in English. And the majority of their content moderation work is focused on English language. And so they're just leaving whole populations unprotected, and they are not the only platform that does that.
Yeah. And I want to build on that a little bit, Anjum. But first I want to rewind to this critique that you offered that is really important, which is a critique of capital, particularly of platform capital and digital capital, that is so urgently necessary to enable us to imagine what alternatives would look like, particularly as we move into digital and AI spaces and think about questions of data justice and put justice front and center. It seems like simultaneously there is a narrative that is being manufactured in the far right ecosystems, right, of a cultural Marxist conspiracy, if you will, or of a woke culture conspiracy. And it seems like that narrative is precisely played out to silence the kinds of critiques that are necessary to hold platform capital to account, if you will.
Absolutely, because they benefit from what's happening, and they have been incredibly successful both at raking in the money but in promoting and recruiting their extremist views. So obviously they want the system to continue as it is, and it mirrors the way that you see, for example, the health industry or the fossil fuel industry, where drug companies will fund activist groups to push for their very expensive drug to be funded by governments.
AstroTurfing, right? We have seen with the tobacco industry here in Aotearoa.
Yeah, and fossil fuel companies and so on. So this is a standard part of the activity around capital protecting itself. And what I do find interesting is the way that particularly let's call them what they are, neo-Nazis, white supremacist groups, have a deliberate strategy of taking words that oppressed people use to talk about their oppression and turn them into negative connotation words and hate words. So when I see politicians here in Aotearoa talking about, oh, it's so woke or whatever, everything is so woke, as if that's a bad thing. And if you ask them, where does the word woke come from? What does it mean? Who started using it? They don't care. They don't have a clue that it started with Black Americans talking about being aware of their oppression. And they are quite happy to take a word that Black Americans started using and turn that into an insult and feel absolutely no shame about it, and happy to uphold the racism underlying all of that.
Yes. And part of that, Anjum, I suppose, is that if you track linguistically, then this communicative inversion, what I talk about in my work, is turning sort of a reality and framing it just as its opposite, is a neo-Nazi technique. So when you're using the term woke culture to deny oppressed people a space for their voices, you are actually mirroring a neo-Nazi technique.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely what they're doing. And I don't for a minute believe it's ignorance. They do it because they know it works. And so, yes, all of that ties in with upholding that system in which outrage is allowed to sell and make money. And our media, because, our mainstream media are now so dependent on social media platforms to promote their news articles, that they now also have to work within that system where they create content that is designed to outrage. Otherwise, they're not going to get the virality, they're not going to get the clicks, the hundreds of awful comments. It's perpetuated in every institution, and I think, in terms of stuff, one of the bravest moves they made was to remove all of their content from Facebook and have no promotion of their website on Facebook. I think that's huge. And turning off comments, because the stuff comment section was well known for how awful it was. So for media companies that have chosen to turn off comments, that was also huge. And it was a necessity in the sense of they just did not have the resources to moderate. So so all parts of the system, and we go back to politicians and the funding that goes in, and so the connection between politics and big capital as well, because we don't have enough restrictions on that, although I think we've improved it a little bit here, but when you look at, for example, the United States, is basically unrestricted, and you can have these PACs and funnel as much money as you like into those and so on. It's just it's all like these ecosystems, this part of the ecosystem, and these players are feeding off each other to protect power and protect big capital.
One of the things I'm thinking of when you discussed how institutions are deployed by majoritarian groups and by hate groups. So you gave that example of how Minister Davidson's comment on most of the violence being perpetrated by white cis men became the site of complaints, and most complaints came responding to that, right? Similarly, I think of Hindutva, within the context of India or Indian diaspora, the ways in which it is mobilized against largely Muslim Indian minorities, but also Christian, Sikh, Dalit, Indian minorities, and often using this language of Hinduphobia, the fear of the Hindu, which I argue in my work is a hate construct, if you will, because it is used to silence dissent, so that then you can continue to perpetuate Hindutva. but that construct then is used in mechanisms of the Human Rights Commission or to complain to the Race Relations Commissioner to say that, oh, this guy is spreading anti Hindu views, and our institutions are not trained to actually evaluate that critique, evaluate that argument, and actually ask what is it saying about the people that are raising the complaint. So where do we go with that, knowing that this is how these infrastructures and institutions are going to be used? How do we hold those in power within these institutions to account when we actually work through these processes to further marginalize voices of oppressed communities?
Yeah, and it's especially difficult when those very institutions are under attack and under political attack and under threat of severely reduced funding for standing up to any kind of political tactics that are marginalising communities, right? It's not easy, but I think it's the engagement and the education and the understanding and requiring more of them, that is really critical. And it's hard to do because as marginalised communities we're stretched in so many directions, plus we have a much smaller resource base and population base to be able to push back against these things, as well as having key people in big institutions and ministries and departments, and having very little power to push back against them. It is challenging. I mean, I remember asking this question of the Corrections Department in 2019, or the head, after the terrorist was in the news for sending letters out that had not been vetted properly by Corrections Department. And I said to them, that there are links, and so they said, oh, we're very careful about the staff that we put around him. And I said, but that there are links between other extremist groups and white supremacists like Hindutva extremists. Have you vetted for that? Didn't know what it was. So this is the previous person. So, and then in a later conversation said that they'd gone back and checked and that what we had said was actually a very valid concern, right? And so, yeah, that you're sitting there with this mix of ignorance, with a mix of we don't know the level of infiltration. So again, when I asked Prime Minister Ardern at that time, again it was 2019, what are your vetting systems to ensure that you don't have white supremacists sitting at senior management levels of ministries or at any level? And particularly we know from overseas experience that they target police, teaching, defence, and corrections. What are you doing? What do you have in place to ensure that they aren't infiltrating? I don't know that they had anything substantial in place before then. It would be a good question to ask now. What is in place, right? I bet you that they can very easily and quickly vet for if anyone has Islamist terrorism, kind of tendencies, any kind of radicalisation, but how, where's the transparency around that? How are they testing that? Have they got it wrong? Are they over-testing that and under-testing the other? The Royal Commission report quite clearly stated that certainly prior to May 2018 there was an undue balance of resources towards Muslims as opposed to other communities, in terms of the securitisation space. So, yeah, so that is another danger that people are sitting within organisations and influencing, and so to challenge them sitting outside, we know from experience how very difficult that is.
And that securitization space, I guess, is a critical space, particularly in the post 9/11 climate war on terror. One might argue, at least there is quite a bit of writing, I think of the work of Professor Deepa Kumar that argues how Islamophobia became the dominant way of thinking within security, intelligence, military infrastructures. And with that, then you would think that that became an entryway both for far right Zionist, white supremacist, Hindutva ideologues to be mainstreamed into these infrastructures because of the underlying Islamophobia that drives the broader lens through which you look at questions of security and terror and extremism.